I felt grief and I felt something close to wonder at exactly the same moment. Not one after the other, not grief fading into wonder or wonder cutting through grief. Both of them at the same time, sharing the same breath, the same second, in the same courtroom. I had never felt both of those things at exactly the same moment before this case. I have felt them together ever since. This is why. The man this case was about was named Marcus Webb. He was 58 years old. He had been sleeping outside for 11 months when he was admitted to Mercy General Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, on September 11, 2022, with double pneumonia. He had a Bible he had been carrying since 1994. Its spine was held together with a strip of electrical tape. When the admitting nurse asked if he had any personal belongings he wanted secured, he said the Bible was the only thing. She wrote that down. It became part of the record. When I read it in the case file weeks before trial, I set the file down for a moment. I want to ask you something before I keep going. Have you ever watched someone decide to protect the only thing they had left and understood from the way they said it that the thing they were protecting was not really the object? Subscribe, because that is the center of this story and I want you here for all of it. The defendant was Reverend Daniel Holt. He was 44 years old, 6 years as a staff chaplain at Mercy General, a master's degree in divinity, 4 letters of commendation in his personnel file. I say that clearly because it matters. He was not a man without care. He was a man who had, on one specific afternoon, stopped caring in the way his position required, and the specific way he stopped is what brought all of us into that courtroom. In the 3rd week of the case, his teenage daughter came to sit in the gallery. Between sessions, she leaned over and set half of a sandwich on the table next to him without a word. He picked it up and ate it without looking away from the proceedings. That gesture told me something about who he was at home. It also told me what this case required of me, to hold that alongside everything else the evidence showed, and to rule from the place where both were true. Marcus Webb entered my courtroom on March 6, 2023 at 9:14 in the morning. He was wearing a collared shirt slightly too large in the shoulders. He walked carefully, the way a person walks in a space they are not sure they are fully permitted to be in, and yet he sat down with a stillness that was its own kind of authority. He set his Bible on the table in front of him, not open, just present. He did not look around the room. He looked at me, directly, the way someone looks when they have decided to see everything clearly and to do that from a place of steadiness. I have sat on this bench for 19 years. I have never watched anyone bring more to a room that had taken so much from them. That is the grace current of this case, and it began the moment Marcus Webb walked through the door. The sorrow current began earlier. It began on September 14, 2022. At approximately 2:47 in the afternoon on that date, Reverend Daniel Holt entered room 318 of Mercy General Hospital. Marcus Webb had been in that room for 3 days, on IV antibiotics, oxygen saturation low, not medically cleared to leave. When Holt entered, Marcus was sitting upright in bed with his Bible open, praying quietly. A nurse's aide named Tanya Briggs was in the hallway directly outside and could hear through the partially open door. What she heard, and documented in a written incident report filed within the hour, was this. Reverend Holt said, "You know, talking to the ceiling isn't going to clear your lungs. People in your situation think prayer is a substitute for having made better decisions. It isn't." Tanya Briggs wrote that Marcus Webb did not respond immediately, that he sat very still, that his hand stayed on the Bible for a long time after Holt left. I read that report at 11 o'clock at night at my kitchen table 2 weeks before trial. I sat with the sentence about his hand for a long time. After that afternoon, Marcus stopped eating. His attending physician, Dr. Lena Park, documented a measurable decline in his participation in his own recovery. On September 17th, he told her, "I don't know if I'm supposed to be here. I don't know if anything I've been carrying matters." Dr. Park wrote that in his chart and filed a separate concern with the hospital's ethics office that same day. That triggered an internal investigation, a 47-page findings report. That report was the first thing I read when this case landed on my desk. The investigation did not resolve the matter to Marcus Webb's satisfaction, and so it came to me. If you are still with me, you have probably gone quiet. Whatever else was happening around you when you started this video has probably faded. Subscribe. That kind of attention deserves the rest of this story. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The legal framework was a civil complaint under Ohio state law. Negligent infliction of emotional distress, combined with a claim of religious discrimination under the patient rights provisions of the hospital's own governing charter. That second claim is the one most people would not think of. When you enter a hospital as a patient, you sign a document that enumerates your rights. One of those rights at Mercy General Hospital is the right to practice your faith freely and without interference while in their care. The hospital chaplain is, in the legal language of that charter, an agent of the institution. When Reverend Holt walked into room 318 and said what he said, he was not a private citizen with an opinion. He was an official representative of a system that had promised Marcus Webb, in writing, that his faith would be protected inside that building. Marcus had not wandered in expecting to be safe. He had signed a document telling him he would be. He had trusted that. That trust is where the sorrow current runs deepest. The moment I felt both rivers at the same time for the first time in this case was on page 31 of the internal investigative transcript. The investigator had asked Reverend Holt directly why he said what he said. He replied, "I thought I was being honest with him. Nobody had been honest with him. I thought that was my job." That sentence stopped me cold. The sorrow of it, the damage that comes when someone mistakes cruelty for candor. And adjacent to grace sat the small, broken shape of a man who genuinely believed he was being useful when he was doing real harm. Both rivers in one sentence. I did not expect that. Before Marcus Webb filed his complaint, before there was a case at all, he wrote a letter to the hospital's chaplaincy department by hand on hospital stationery. He was still a patient when he wrote it. The letter was entered into evidence. In it he said, "I am not writing this because I want anything taken away from him. I am writing this because I think something should be added to him and to however you train the people who walk into rooms like mine. I had nothing in that room except what I believed. What I believed was enough. It should have been enough for him, too." That letter is the grace current from its source. A man without a home address, without an attorney, writing from a hospital bed because he believed a letter could change something. That belief is the current. It runs through this entire case. The hospital argued the statement was an isolated lapse, that Holt had shown genuine remorse, that corrective action had already been taken. They were not wrong about those facts. They were wrong about what those facts resolved. This case was not about whether the hospital's values were good. It was about what happened when those values failed the person they were supposed to protect. Here is what I am offering. The rest of this story, told the same way I have been telling it. Nothing held back, nothing resolved before it should be, nothing softened because it is easier that way. Subscribe if that is what you want. I will keep going. The defense submitted text messages between Reverend Holt and a chaplaincy colleague sent 2 days after the incident, before any formal complaint existed. In one of them, Holt had written, "I said something to a patient today that I can't stop thinking about. I don't know where it came from. I don't think it came from me, but I said it, and that means it came from me." That is the message I wrote down. Both rivers in one sentence. The acknowledgement of harm in the first current, the honest confusion of a person facing the gap between who they think they are and what they actually did in the second. I looked at it for a long time. It did not change what had to be ruled, but it changed something in the room. Dr. Park testified for 2 hours. She said, "My patient's trajectory changed after September 14th. I have seen trajectories change for many reasons. This was not a coincidence." That testimony belonged entirely to the sorrow current. No argument addressed it adequately. Then Marcus Webb took the stand for 1 hour and 43 minutes. Near the end, he was asked what he wanted from the proceedings. He said, "I want whoever walks into the next room like mine to know that the person in that bed already found something, that they don't need to be fixed. They need to be met." I wrote it down. I looked at it for a long time. Both things I was feeling were in that one sentence. I did not expect that. I want to tell you about the summer of 1998. I was 31. My father had been in a hospital for 11 days. One afternoon, a volunteer came into his room. Not a chaplain, just a person who gave time on Tuesday afternoons. She sat by the window and asked my father what he was thinking about. He told her about a fishing trip from 1967. She asked him one question about the color of the water. He smiled, telling her. She left 30 minutes later. That was the last day he was fully awake. I do not know her name. I do not know what she believed. I know she walked into a room and met the person who was already there. I placed that memory next to this case the way you set two stones from different rivers on a table beside each other. Not the same stone, but you can see they came from the same kind of place. On March 9th, the third day of proceedings, during a recess, I watched a man in the gallery lean over and say something quietly to Marcus Webb. Marcus nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when they have been told something they already knew but needed to hear out loud. The man put his hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder and walked out without returning. I did not know him. I did not hear what was said. I know the nod was not sad, and it was not relieved. It was both at once, the nod of someone who has lost something and has chosen, in the same moment, to keep going. I just realized, saying that out loud, that I have never described that nod to anyone before. I have thought about it many times, but never put it into words until right now. Subscribe. That nod is going to matter more in a few minutes. Subscribe now. There was one more piece of evidence that sat differently from everything else. A get well card, signed by 17 staff members at Mercy General and given to Marcus Webb during his inpatient stay, before any complaint, before any proceedings. Tanya Briggs had organized it quietly, walking the hallways without telling administration. 17 signatures, nurses, aides, and orderly, 2 people from dietary services. In the card, Tanya had written, "What happened to you was not what this place is supposed to be. You matter here." That card is both rivers in one object, the sorrow of why it was necessary, the grace of why someone made it anyway. When I reviewed it as evidence, I held it a moment longer than I needed to. The verdict was civil liability, Mercy General Hospital and Reverend Daniel Holt, jointly and severally. I announced it at 10:52 in the morning on March 22, 2023. Before I spoke, Marcus Webb sat with both hands flat on the table, the Bible between them. Reverend Holt looked directly at the surface of the defense table. My hands held the edges of my notes. I had decided carefully, knowing this ruling had to hold the weight of what was lost, and also leave room for what might still happen. Those two things do not always fit in the same ruling. In this case they did. I had made sure they did. The only visible reaction in the courtroom was Tanya Briggs in the second row. One short breath. Then she pressed both hands against her face. Not grief, not relief, both at once. That is the only description that is fully true. I want to stop here for just a moment, not for effect, because what I'm about to say is something I shaped very carefully, every single word, and I have carried it since the morning I said it. Subscribe while I take that second. Subscribe and stay. Okay, let me keep going. I am ordering you to pay restitution of $47,500, $30,000 designated directly to Marcus Webb, for documented medical costs and the measurable decline in his recovery following September 14th. $17,500 designated to the Southside Community Overnight Shelter in Columbus, Ohio, the shelter Marcus Webb had been connected to before his hospitalization. That designation is not punitive. It is the closest I can get in a legal sentence to saying that what was taken from Marcus in room 318 was not only his, it belonged to every person who will ever lie in a room like that one. I am also ordering you, Reverend Holt, to complete 400 hours of direct service at the Southside Community Overnight Shelter, not in any administrative role, but on the floor, serving meals, sitting with people, doing the work your title claims you are called to do in the place where the people your institution failed actually live. You begin within 30 days. You finish within 18 months. The shelter director files a quarterly report with this court, not just whether the hours were completed, but whether you showed up on time. And there is one more thing. I am ordering a 12-month program of pastoral supervision with a licensed clinical supervisor specializing in chaplaincy ethics. Meetings no fewer than twice a month, reports to this court at 6 months and at completion. The purpose is not to punish you for believing something wrong. It is to give you the structure to understand the distance between what you thought you were doing and what you actually did. Closing that distance, for you and for whoever comes after you, is what this order is about. One condition: if at 12 months your supervisor certifies in writing that you engaged with full honesty, not performed honesty, full honesty, I will consider a 15% reduction in the restitution schedule. That condition is my way of saying something I cannot say as a ruling. I believe you are capable of that kind of honesty. The text message you sent 2 days after the incident told me so. You have not yet decided to live by what you wrote. I am giving you a structure in which to make that decision. What I said to Reverend Holt directly and what I want to say again now was this. What you did on September 14th, 2022 at 2:47 in the afternoon was walk into a room where a man had almost nothing and take the one thing from him that had cost him nothing to carry and everything to keep. You used the language of care to deliver the opposite of care. You carried a title that said you were safe and used it to tell him he was not. That is specific. That is what the evidence established. I am not going to soften it. To Marcus Webb, and to every person who has ever been in a room like that one, the evidence showed that Marcus held his Bible more tightly after that afternoon, not less. That is not incidental. That is the record. To you, Reverend Holt, the charges do not contain this, but you should hear it. You came into this work because you believed that presence mattered. The text message you sent 2 days after shows that belief still lives in you beneath what happened in that room. That is not an excuse. It is a reason this court expects more from you. To everyone in this room, you came here because something broke. The law can name what broke. It cannot put it back. What puts it back is what Tanya Briggs did with a card and 17 signatures. What puts it back is what Marcus Webb did when he wrote a letter asking not for punishment, but for something to be added. The law can make space for that. You do the work. And this is the fact, plain, nothing added. A man sleeping on the street in Ohio carried a Bible for 28 years because it told him he mattered. One afternoon in September, a credentialed representative of a licensed institution told him he did not. The next morning, he was still holding the Bible. That is the fact. That is all of it, and it is enough. You just heard what I said to him in that courtroom. I want you to hold that. Subscribe before we go further, because what happened after I finished speaking is the part of this case I have thought about most. Subscribe now. When the courtroom began to empty, I remained seated. I watched Tanya Briggs cross the room to Marcus Webb. She said something, one sentence, quiet, just for him. I could not hear it, but I could see that he closed his eyes for a moment when she said it, the way you close your eyes when something lands somewhere true. Then she walked out. Marcus stood with his hand on the Bible, still, just as Tanya had described him standing in room 318. Then he picked it up and walked toward the door. Before I stood up, I picked up my pen. I did not write anything. I just held it. That is what I did. That is what came from the place where both rivers were. On November 14, 2023, 7 months after the verdict, the Southside Community Overnight Shelter filed a quarterly report. The shelter director included a handwritten note at the bottom of the official form. She wrote, "He has been here every week. He does not talk much. He listens more than anyone I have seen come through this door. Last Tuesday, he sat with a man for 2 hours who had not spoken to anyone in 3 days. He did not leave until the man was asleep." The sorrow is still in that note, that the listening had to be ordered. The grace is also there, that when it was required, the person chose to be fully present inside it. No appeal was filed. Both parties accepted the ruling within the 30-day window. When I was informed of that on April 22, 2023, I felt the specific relief of a door staying open, not triumph, the quiet fact of something that did not get closed before it was ready. What this case showed me about holding two feelings at once is something I am still working out. I have been on this bench for 19 years, and I have always felt sorrow and grace in sequence, one arriving, then the other. This case was the first time they arrived together and demanded to be carried together. I think that was because of Marcus Webb, because the specific quality of his steadiness made it impossible to feel only one thing at a time. His refusal to become only his wound kept both rivers running from the first page of the file to the last word of the verdict. I have never said that out loud in any professional context before today. This case is the one that earned it being said. To anyone who has been in a room where someone with authority told you that what you were carrying to survive was not valid, I want to tell you what the record showed. Marcus Webb's hand stayed on his Bible. Both things were true at once. The sorrow did not cancel the grace. The grace did not erase the sorrow. That is what the evidence shows. I have not stopped thinking about it. To anyone who has caused real harm from a place of genuine conviction, who believed they were being useful when they were being harmful. I have watched people in that position move in two directions. The ones who moved toward something had one thing in common. They named the specific harm, not the general failure. Not, I made a mistake, but I said this specific thing to this specific person on this specific afternoon, and I know what it cost him. The specificity is not punishment. The specificity is where the work begins. That is what I would say to every person who has sat in that chair. On a Tuesday morning last February, 11 months after the verdict, I was walking from my car to the courthouse. I passed a man sitting on the steps of the building across the street. He was reading. I did not slow down. I looked. I do not know if it was the Bible. I do not know if it was him. What I know is that for 3 seconds I felt both rivers at the same time, standing on a sidewalk in Columbus, Ohio. That is why I told you this story. Subscribe. Leave something in the comments if you have ever been in a room where someone chose to show up anyway and decided to meet what was there. This space belongs to the people who know both rivers, the ones willing to stay inside both at the same time.